In Calhoun County, Georgia, spring brought heat the way it always had, quietly, without apology. By March of 1852, the cotton looked almost weightless, as though the fields had caught hold of cloud and decided not to let it go. From the road, Willow Creek Plantation read like any other, pale columns, orderly rows, a low hill that caught the sun and kept it. Up close, it was different. It smelled of vinegar-clean rooms and sweat pressed into linen. It kept secrets in its rafters the way a church kept prayers, close, repetitive, and dangerous to repeat aloud. Thomas Bogard lived like a man who believed the world would obey him if he kept his ledgers straight. His hands were steady, his voice was calm. He drank bourbon in the hours when daylight faded and shut his study door as if sealing in both peace and control. His wife, Eleanor Whitmore Bogard, moved through the house like something made to be admired rather than understood, elegant in her posture, precise with her silence, and fragile in the places only servants were allowed to see. She had lost 3 pregnancies before the one that finally took. The miscarriages had not made her gentle. They had made her careful. After the 3rd, her grief turned inward, and Eleanor learned to carry it without showing it. She wrote in a diary that Sarah, housemaid, confidante, witness, kept finding hidden under folded cloth or behind the back of a dresser mirror. At night Eleanor would pray as if bargaining with a God that never answered, her voice low and rhythmic until even the house seemed to hold its breath. In the evenings she walked the halls with the same measured pace she used to use when visiting dying relatives, slow, as though her movement might prevent fate from catching up. Thomas would notice her stillness only when it irritated him. He believed women should be grateful for survival. He believed fear was an embarrassment. Eleanor believed something else, that the world sometimes watched back. The first time she saw it, she did not name it. She only felt the air change. It was near the east field, where a line of willows grew thin and ragged along the creek. Beyond that, the family cemetery sat behind wrought iron, small stones pressed into earth, the generations of Bogards stacked one above another in quiet dignity. The well lay between the cemetery and the houses, an old circle of stone that gathered rainwater and moonlight alike. Eleanor was walking toward the study when she saw the figure. Or rather, she saw the interruption. The man-shaped shape, tall, motionless, did not look supernatural at first. It looked like a person who had forgotten how to move, as if he were waiting for instructions that never came. He stood where he shouldn't have been, where the dark made a shape out of nothing. And he did not look at Eleanor so much as look through her, as if she were a pane of glass. Her throat tightened. Her handkerchief trembled. When she turned and faced her husband later that same evening, Thomas was already seated. Bourbon waited in a glass beside his ledger book. The ceiling fan whined in a lazy loop. He looked up with mild irritation, the way a man looks up when his peace has been interrupted by weather or servants. "There's something in the east field," Eleanor said. Thomas dismissed it the way he dismissed everything that threatened his sense of command. "A stray. An idle man. Tell Jackson to check the fence." Eleanor gripped her handkerchief until the cloth bit into her skin. She did not explain that the figure never approached. She did not say that it never fled. She did not say that when lightning caught the eastern trees, the figure seemed to brighten not with fire, but with a stillness that pulled light toward itself. Thomas already believed he had solved it. Eleanor did not. That night she did not sleep. By dawn, she had written in her diary, the ink slanted and urgent. "I saw him again. He never moves. He only watches." For 6 weeks, the figure returned in patterns that made the world feel smaller. 8 times it appeared, always within sight of the east field or the water's edge, at the old well under the willow where the creek curved, at the iron gate of the cemetery where 3 generations lay in stone sleep, and once, when the moon was thin enough to make the world look sketched rather than real, standing between 2 graves as if choosing which one had been meant for it. Thomas treated each report as a form of hysteria, heat-induced imagination, stress, grief turning into stories. He laughed in the way men laugh when they're afraid of being wrong. He told Eleanor her mind was inventing companionship where none existed. Her mind did invent something, though not companionship. It invented dread. Sarah, the housemaid who had served Eleanor since childhood, noticed the dread long before Eleanor admitted it. Sarah had always recognized the small tells, the way Eleanor stopped humming while cleaning, the way her fingers lingered on doors as if checking whether they would remain shut, the way she stood at windows too long, staring toward the east field as if waiting for a visitor. When Eleanor finally told Sarah she was with child, she did not bring joy into the room. She brought coldness. "Promise me," Eleanor said, as if pleading with fate itself. "You won't tell him yet." Sarah knew better than to ask what him meant. She only nodded and helped Eleanor prepare as if preparing might slow something inevitable. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed too fast. At first it seemed like a blessing. Doctors visited with caution, weighing her body as if her existence were a miracle with fine print. Dr. Williams, called from town, examined her with professional restraint and offered tea, rest, and reassurance. "This is miraculous," he said. "Your health is." His words faltered when her eyes sharpened. Eleanor didn't look like a woman reassured. She looked like a woman bracing. She began spending hours in the unused nursery. The room had belonged to no child. It had been prepared once and then abandoned. Eleanor rocked slowly in a chair near the window, staring toward the east field as if the horizon held an answer. Sometimes she spoke to empty air. Sometimes she spoke as if someone else stood there listening. It was not until the moment her body shifted, until the pregnancy stopped behaving like flesh and began behaving like something else, that Eleanor broke into clearer fear. One night, while Sarah helped her change for bed, Eleanor whispered a sentence so strange Sarah felt it land like cold metal. "This child isn't growing inside me," she said. Sarah paused with the fabric in her hands. "What do you mean?" Eleanor smiled with a thinness that looked like politeness. "I'm growing inside it." Over the following weeks, Eleanor's figure expanded with unnatural speed. Mirrors became enemies. She refused them, covering reflective surfaces with cloth. At night she locked her door even though it was already locked and checked again and again as if the key might forget its job. Thomas reacted the way he always reacted to things he couldn't control, by trying to document them. He wrote in his ledger that he was grateful and afraid in equal measure. He sent letters to specialists in Augusta and Charleston, asking for advice as if medical correspondence could stop whatever lived beyond his view. Dr. Williams visited repeatedly, his carriage wheels sinking into red Georgia mud after storms that arrived at the wrong hours. He always washed his hands before and after examining Eleanor, as if something in her body resisted cleansing. Sometimes, when Dr. Williams stepped closer, Eleanor's gaze flickered with a kind of recognition. Not recognition of the doctor. Recognition of a presence only she could sense. Then came September. The storm did not announce itself with heat-thick thunder. It came like a decision made elsewhere. Lightning split the sky in white fractures, the kind that made windows look like they were made of paper. Servants ran for the basement. Thomas drank in his study, stubborn as a locked door. When the screams began upstairs, they did not rise like ordinary pain. They roared. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was not rest. It was absence, too deep, too clean. Sarah ran to the bedroom. She found Eleanor staring through the window, rain striking the glass like small signals. Outside, in the brief bright moments of lightning, the figure stood again tall, still, unblinking. And when Sarah turned back, she understood why Eleanor had refused mirrors. The child was already here. The birth had been too fast, too easy. Thomas arrived only when he heard the infant cry. When he entered, he saw Eleanor cradling a baby whose eyes did not behave like human eyes. The pupils were amber and vertical, as if the child's gaze belonged to something adapted for water rather than air. When the baby looked at Thomas, the air seemed to tighten around them. Thomas's throat worked but no words came. Eleanor lifted the infant carefully, as if handling a fragile instrument. Thomas asked what any father would ask in a moment meant to clarify the world. "Who is the father of this child?" Eleanor looked at him as though he had finally asked the correct question. "He was watching us from the fields," she said. "Now he no longer needs to wait." That was the night Willow Creek changed forever. The storm stripped the trees bare. The fields glistened with rainwater and broken branches. But the true stripping happened inside the house. The air grew thick and metallic, heavy with a scent that did not belong to earth. It smelled like old coins left too long in pockets, like rust stirred into the breath. Servants started avoiding the nursery. They did not need to be told to fear it. Fear walked beside them without invitation. They whispered that the baby did not cry. Not once. Not when hungry, not when left alone, not when Sarah attempted to feed him. The child opened his eyes and watched her with attention that did not resemble a newborn's. He tracked her movements as if measuring distance and speed before considering whether food mattered. Dr. Williams arrived late the next day due to flooded roads. He examined the infant with shaking fingers and a face made of careful calm. "He's healthy," he said, voice low. Then, after a long pause, he added, "He's exceptionally so." But later, much later, the doctor's notes were found sealed within the stonework of a courthouse wall, long after the man himself had been forgotten by most living memories. In those notes, he wrote, "Ocular anomaly of unknown type. Pupil vertical. Amber hue. Subject alert beyond normal parameters." As if describing the world were the only way to survive it. Thomas tried to keep distance. He drank. He wrote letters to his brother in Charleston. The words he chose were not accusations so much as attempts to bargain with reality. "I did what I thought was right. I do not know what has happened. I cannot look at him." Eleanor did not fear the baby. She feared the gap between the baby and what waited for him. She refused a wet nurse. She fed him herself with a devotion that seemed less like motherhood and more like service. She rarely slept. When she did, she dreamed aloud words in a language no one recognized, the syllables smooth and wet as if spoken underwater. On one occasion Sarah found her awake and humming. The sound wasn't a lullaby. It was rhythmic, low and rolling, almost like waves pushing against stones. The child's eyes moved with the hum. His pupils tightened and loosened as the melody changed, responding as though the tune were a key. When Sarah asked what Eleanor was singing, Eleanor smiled faintly. "He remembers it," she said. "It's how they call to him. And then, he is beautiful beyond measure. They will be pleased." Thomas began avoiding the nursery altogether. He took to the barn, to the distant fields, to any place where he could breathe air that smelled less like milk and salt. At home, he stopped speaking the child's name. He had tried to keep using James, the name he'd chosen, but it became harder with each day, like a tongue trying to say a word that no longer fit in the mouth. He altered his will. James inherited nothing. The household grew colder. The house grew quieter. Eleanor began walking the property before dawn with the baby in her arms. She traced the same path each morning, from the house to the east field, from the east field to the family cemetery, and back again to the front porch. When Sarah asked why she returned the way she did, Eleanor answered with a smile that looked like resignation. "He must know where he came from," she whispered, "and where he'll go back." Dr. Williams continued to visit through November. He recorded unnatural growth. At 3 months, the child sat upright as if born already knowing how to balance his spine. Sometimes, when Dr. Williams stood under lamplight, he saw a faint glow along the infant's skin, not enough to call it supernatural by daylight standards, but enough to make a man's confidence tremble. He did not tell Thomas, at least not in any way that could be proven. By December, the Bogard home felt like a place waiting for something to arrive. Thomas slept with a pistol under his pillow. Eleanor slept less than ever. Her diary entries grew stranger. She recorded the phases of the moon as if tracking tides no ocean could produce. One night Sarah woke to Eleanor singing again. This time, the words were clear enough to understand even if the meaning remained impossible. Eleanor wasn't singing to the baby. She was singing with him. Two voices, one human, one smaller than it should have been, carried the same melody, repeating like an echo through deep water. When Thomas heard it from the hallway, he froze. For a moment, he thought he could hear the sea. They were hundreds of miles from any shoreline. By morning, Thomas made a decision meant to restore order by removing witnesses. He told the overseer he was sending his wife and child to a coastal house near Brunswick for their health. For sanity, he added, as though he were doing them a kindness. Eleanor did not protest. She only smiled, a knowing expression that carried something like gratitude. "They'll find us there," she whispered. The sea always keeps its promises. 3 days before Christmas, the move happened. The plantation wagon rolled away down the red road, and Thomas stood on Willow Creek's porch until the dust vanished. The air by then had turned sharp. Frost brushed the edges of fields. The baby lay silent, wide-eyed from the moment the wagon started moving. He did not cry. He did not blink. Thomas wrote his brother a final letter that night, his hand cramped from writing too long. "I have sent them away," he wrote. "Perhaps the sea will take what the land should never have borne." Then he sealed the envelope. Then he poured bourbon again. He did not sleep. The Brunswick property was smaller, older, weathered by salt wind and time. The house seemed half swallowed by dunes. When the servants brought in boxes, they complained about the smell of brine inside the rooms, as if the ocean had already claimed the walls. Eleanor took the upper bedroom facing the water. The cradle was placed near the window so the tide could be heard at night. The days passed with an uneasy calm that made everyone more alert than comfort would. Sarah watched the baby, James, as Eleanor insisted on calling him even as she sensed the lie in that insistence. He grew quickly, pushing past what should have been possible. By the end of January his legs were strong enough to propel himself upright. His eyes followed the waves. Unblinking. On certain days Sarah heard him hum softly when the tide changed, blending his sound into the rhythm of water. Eleanor did not scold. She did not soothe him away from the shore. She encouraged it the way a teacher encourages a student toward learning. Eleanor stopped wearing shoes. She stood in shallows at the edge of the beach with the baby in her arms, her gown clinging wet to her legs. When Sarah begged her to come inside, Eleanor only answered, "It's teaching him the way back." Thomas, meanwhile, remained near the old plantation in spirit if not in body. He kept sending letters to no one. He talked to himself in the upstairs hall. Servants swore they heard dripping water when it hadn't rained in weeks. He behaved like a man building distance from a thing that could measure distance better than he could. Then came the night the fire began. A storm rose off the coast with wind driving the tide higher hour by hour. A fisherman on the bluff saw the flames and said it looked as if the sea itself lit the house from below. By the time neighbors reached the property, rescue was too late. The roof collapsed. Fire roared against black water. 2 bodies were pulled from the wreckage the next morning, both unrecognizable after the burns. Of Eleanor and her child, there was nothing. No remains. No footprints in the sand. Only the smell of salt and smoke. Sarah and another servant who had accompanied them died too, but the way the sea took them felt like a continuation rather than an ending. Their faces were burned. Their hands looked as if they'd tried to dig their way out of something tighter than a house, something that had been waiting beneath the floorboards. Mary survived long enough to be found wandering the beach in the hours after the fire. Her hair was tangled with seaweed. Her dress was soaked to the waist. She seemed, at first glance, like any hysterical witness until she began speaking. Not in full sentences. Not in consistent time. "They came for him," she said, repeating the same phrase as if it were a prayer. Just like she said. When asked who they were, Mary's face twisted as if remembering too much. "Not men," she whispered. "Not anymore." Then Mary laughed, first soft, then sharp, then suddenly screaming until it sounded less like laughter and more like a body trying to expel fear faster than it could be breathed out. The sheriff called it a tragic accident, lightning or carelessness. The bodies lost to the surf. The usual reasons men use when the truth is too large to fit into a report. But a deputy, his name forgotten, his memory maybe not, told his wife later something he never wrote down. He said that when the tide went out, there were marks in wet sand leading from the house to the ocean. Not footprints. Something whiter. Something dragged. Like a sweep of fins or a tail's broad motion through water that wasn't supposed to be there. When Thomas received the telegram about the Brunswick fire, he collapsed in his study. For 3 days he barely ate. For 3 days he did not speak, as if language had become dangerous. On the fourth day he rose and gave orders. The Brunswick house would be razed to the ground. Every stone hauled away. The land sold. He swore that no Bogart would ever set foot on that beach again. Servants obeyed, but Thomas's obsession didn't leave. It only changed shape. Some nights he paced upstairs and repeated one phrase over and over. "She was watching us," he would mutter. "Now she's watching me." After the fire, Thomas never returned to the coast. He sealed the shutters at Willow Creek and lived like a man locked in an argument with the dark. The next month, the house remained silent except for footsteps that crossed the upper hall at midnight. Servants swore they did not belong to Thomas. He ate little, drank too much, slept not at all. When the doctor visited, Thomas insisted on one thing. She went back to them. No one asked what he meant. Some questions cost too much. By spring of 1853, the plantation began to decay from the inside. Paint peeled in strips from the parlor walls. The air grew wetter. The scent in the fields turned metallic, like rust stirred into damp earth. Livestock refused water from the eastern pond. Workers complained that the soil near the far fence turned black even when the rest of the land stayed bright with cotton. That summer Thomas dismissed nearly half his staff. He slept by day and walked the property at night. When the overseer asked what he was doing, Thomas paused at the eastern boundary and faced the treeline where the ground sank into marsh. "Listening," he answered. In late autumn, a lawyer arrived from Edison to finalize a sale. Thomas had decided to leave Georgia entirely. He was pale, thin, and soft-spoken now, less a ruler than a man drained by too many nights spent communicating with a presence no one else could hear. He sold everything: house, land, workers. He kept only one strip. The eastern boundary, overgrown brush leading toward the old creek, he refused to sell. He set it aside in a trust, with instructions to build and maintain a stone wall there for all generations. When the clause was signed, notarized, and sealed in Baltimore, the ink looked ordinary enough. No one understood why a man would pay for a wall in the middle of pine forest. Thomas never married again. He died in 1877. His fortune went to schools and churches, but his will included one strange instruction: the wall must never be taken down, and it must be inspected after every full moon in September. No explanation. No context. Only orders. Long after Thomas had been buried and forgotten, the wall still stood. By 1961, researchers from Atlanta University stumbled upon the Bogart records while compiling plantation life data. The lead scholar, Dr. Marcus Wilson, became fascinated by the contradictions: a will that changed too suddenly, a coastal fire too convenient, and a maintenance trust that ensured a stone barrier would remain exactly where no one could say it belonged. Wilson visited Calhoun County that fall. The original plantation house was gone. Flat farmland replaced most cotton fields. Scattered ruins remained like broken teeth. But the wall, still there, stood 6 feet high and 2 feet thick, built of local granite. Moss crawled along its base. No one could say who repaired it after storms. Farmers called it the Bogart Wall. They said the bank paid for it. Always had. Wilson's field notes described an oppressive atmosphere. Birds avoided the area. The air near the wall smelled faintly of salt, though the ocean was more than 100 miles away. On September 15, 1961, the anniversary of James Bogart's birth, Wilson returned alone. The moon was full and bright enough to turn the fields silver. At 11:30 p.m. he wrote of a pressure shift, a deep pull like tide water dragging something beneath the surface. Then he saw it. A figure, or perhaps only a shadow standing beyond the wall in the field. It did not move. But Wilson felt the sensation of being observed, like the world had shifted from being something he inspected to something that inspected him. He left at 12:05 a.m., drove back to his hotel, and told his assistant he would not return after dark again. His last note in his journal read, "Some histories are best left undisturbed." The study Wilson published 2 years later treated the Bogart materials as an appendix. Too strange. Too uncertain for academic acceptance. Wilson retired soon after, but the story didn't die. It only traveled. In 1968, items connected to the Bogard case surfaced at an estate auction in New Orleans. Among them was a water-damaged leather journal stamped with the initials EWB. The handwriting matched Eleanor's. The first legible entry was dated November 26, 1852, 2 months after James's birth. Thomas believes I do not notice his absence. He thinks I mourn it. How can I explain that his distance is a relief? He looks at James with fear. If he knew the truth, he would not fear but worship. His eyes grow brighter each day. They are beautiful beyond measure. Sarah avoids his gaze, but I see what waits beyond the eastern field. They watch through him. They wait for the tide. The pages that followed were nearly erased by water, but one line survived. He spoke today. Not nonsense. A name I cannot write. When he said it, I felt water move inside me. They are coming. I have already chosen. The final dated entry read January 9, 1853, the night before the fire that destroyed the Brunswick house. Thomas hides us here thinking he has escaped scandal. He does not understand. This was always where it would end. They will come with the midnight tide. The sea calls its own. I will go with them. Dr. Wilson verified the journal's authenticity. He concluded it was not simply a confession but possibly an invitation. In 1972, marine archaeologists studying the waters near Brunswick discovered a circular depression on the seafloor 50 feet wide, plunging into darkness. Sonar couldn't find the bottom. Divers reported hearing rhythmic sounds underwater, a heartbeat or distant machinery. One diver described lights beneath silt, as though the sea were watching from within. They abandoned the site after 2 divers surfaced vomiting seawater. The area was labeled a natural anomaly. Ship caution advised. Dr. Wilson died in 1974, but before he did he sent a final note to the Historical Society. The wall still stands. For a time, it did. Through war storms and neglect, the stone barrier remained untouched. Then maintenance funds ran out around 1986. Checks stopped. People stopped inspecting it. And that's when the stories began shifting. Residents near the old plantation claimed to hear water rushing underground during autumn nights. Hunters reported depressions in the soil shaped like scales or fins. A few families claimed they saw lights drifting low over the trees, 3 perfect points moving together, slow and silent in a triangle formation. By late 20th century, the Bogard case had been reduced to a regional ghost story, a plantation fire, a vanished mother, a child with strange eyes, folklore used to frighten tourists driving through Calhoun County. But folklore waits. The forest swallowed Willow Creek. The grand house vanished. Cotton became pines. Only the family cemetery survived, a cluster of crooked iron bars half buried in moss. The Bogard wall remained half collapsed but standing as if it refused to forget. No one remembered who repaired it. Yet somehow, after every September storm, missing stones reappeared. No one saw who replaced them. And the wall never stayed broken long. Then, in 2004, the story resurfaced, not in a journal or a campfire retelling, but in a laboratory. Tara Williams, a marine biology graduate student at the University of Georgia, studied fish populations along the coast. Mutations linked to salinity and industrial runoff were expected. What wasn't expected was a batch of samples from waters near Brunswick and Sapelo Island that refused to behave like contamination. Under a microscope, the eyes shimmered with reflective gold hue. DNA sequencing produced results no database could categorize: an unidentified gene marker, unregistered and impossible. A double helix with a third faint spiral wrapping it like a thread of light. The mutation affected optic nerves, giving fish vertical pupils and enhanced night vision. Tara noted it as an anomaly resembling cross-species coding with human-like sequences. Her advisor dismissed it privately as contamination. Yet in his correspondence, he wrote that his grandfather once told him about a boy born near the coast with eyes like a cat and skin that glowed underwater. His town called him the Sea Child. He thought it was nonsense. Now he wasn't sure. In 2011, during renovations of the Calhoun County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed compartment behind the cornerstone. Inside was a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth, medical record storage style from the 1850s. One document bore Dr. James Williams's signature. He had been the physician who attended Eleanor's birth. His deposition described a body that was not simply abnormal but layered with features no man expected to see in an infant. The child exhibited peculiarities beyond the eyes, faint skin luminescence under dim light, subtle webbing between fingers, and evidence of gill-like structures beginning beneath the jawline. When Dr. Williams touched these structures, the infant gripped his wrist with unnatural strength and produced a vision of a dark shore, black sand, figures moving in glowing water, eyes identical to the child's. The vision ended when contact broke. Dr. Williams wrote he would not speak of it because he feared his own mind more than the truth. The deposition ended abruptly with a signature and seal. It had been placed inside the wall months later during a centennial ceremony, as if the doctor had wanted the record hidden where only time could locate it. The journal's appendix and the sealed documents fed rumors for years, whether the Bogard case was an early mention of what modern folklore called deep ones, people of the tide said to live beneath the Atlantic shelf. But scholars focused on patterns, and patterns are harder to dismiss than monsters. In 2013, a research team received permission to excavate the Brunswick property. The house was long reduced to sand and fragments. Yet beneath the foundation, they found a perfect circle of stones, blackened but intact, buried deep in the earth. The formation did not match known 19th-century architecture. Older. Possibly indigenous. In the center lay small figurines carved from a dark, glossy stone unlike anything found on land. Each figure was shaped like a human but not entirely, limbs too long, eyes too wide, faces smooth and eyeless as if waiting to decide how they would look at the world. One carving differed. It showed a tall being holding a smaller one against its chest, mother and child, or something older carrying something new. Lab results suggested volcanic glass of unknown marine origin, possibly deep ocean vent material. The carvings were found 30 miles inland under a house built in 1850. No official explanation was released. The findings vanished into storage. Misfiled under unknown artifacts. By 2015, the story reached beyond academia. A television production company arrived in September intending to film an episode about Southern hauntings. Their cameras failed the first night. Their audio equipment recorded rhythmic sounds like breathing. 3 crew members reported identical dreams of standing on a shoreline and seeing luminous figures rise from waves. The producer later said they had learned not to expect that places would cooperate. But this place had wanted to be seen, not frightened. The episode was never released. In 2017, a genealogical project requested DNA samples from descendants of plantation families. Only one person agreed, Richard Bogard, 73 years old, retired naval engineer living in Portland, Oregon. The results flagged genetic divergence beyond known human variation. When the technician called to verify, Richard laughed. His family carried stories about a boy who went into the sea and a mother who followed. His grandfather always said they carried the ocean in their blood. Richard had never believed him until he joined the Navy. 30 years at sea, never seasick, always felt like he was going home. 6 months later, Richard died in his sleep. His final request was unusual and specific, his ashes scattered 1 mile off the coast of Brunswick, the location where the circular seafloor depression had been mapped in 1972. When the captain poured the ashes into the tide, he reported something impossible. The water glowed where the ashes fell, just a moment, as if welcoming them back. Then came September 2019, a Category 3 hurricane that made landfall on the Georgia coast. It should have weakened inland. Instead, its path bent unnaturally westward, following a narrow corridor of destruction leading straight to Calhoun County and the ruins of Willow Creek. Meteorologists called it an atmospheric anomaly. When it was over, the Bogard Wall was gone. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Erased. In its place lay hundreds of black stones scattered through pine forest. Some were carved with figures identical to those found at Brunswick. Locals collected them as curiosities. One was placed in the Calhoun County Historical Museum under glass. The curator wrote the caption himself. Recovered from the site of the former Bogard Plantation, 2019. Material unknown. Symbolism undetermined, but locals know what it means. They know it means Eleanor. Eleanor Whitmore Bogard, the woman who walked into the sea. They said that if you drove past the old plantation land during the September full moon, you could still hear waves even though the ocean was more than 100 miles away. By 2020, the Bogard story settled again into silence. The hurricane was over. The wall was gone. The black carvings became folklore, scattered across mantles, roadside gift shops, and cheap stories meant to keep attention for 5 minutes and no more. But to a few, those stones were not relics. They were markers. Dreams began to recur. A handful of people across Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas reported the same dream, standing on a shoreline that glowed from beneath, hearing voices calling from the surf. Not in words, but in rhythm. Some described it as music, others as breathing. Some woke drenched as if seawater had soaked them through. Local news blamed stress, anxiety, post-hurricane trauma. Psychologists made room for explanations that allowed the world to remain ordinary. A retired marine biologist, Dr. Tara Williams, now older, now with less patience for dismissals, recognized something in the reports that pulled at her memory. She reopened her old genetic data from 2004. She ran it through modern software. What she found was impossible to categorize as contamination anymore. The triple helix structure wasn't confined to marine life. It was appearing in human DNA databases, unpublished and hidden in raw data. Not disease. Not random mutation. Inheritance. She spent months tracing origin. Genealogical paths. Migration routes. Overlapping anomalies. Each line, each branch, each inexplicable marker curved back toward one place, the Georgia coast, specifically Calhoun County, Willow Creek. In an email to a trusted colleague, she wrote, "If this is real, and it is, then whatever happened in 1853 didn't end. It adapted. It bred." The colleague never replied. 3 days later, Tara Williams vanished. Her apartment door was unlocked. Her computer wiped. Her car still parked where she had left it. The only thing missing was a small carved stone from her desk, a black figure with long arms and hollow eyes. Around the same time, a young journalist named Elena Morris began investigating similar coastal anomalies. Her grandmother had grown up in Calhoun County. She told stories about sea people, stories the family dismissed as superstition. Then Elena's son was born in 2018 with amber eyes and vertical pupils that narrowed to slits in sunlight. Doctors called it congenital optical mutation. Elena suspected something older. She dug through old newspaper clippings and copies of appendices from Dr. Wilson's unpublished work. When she laid them in chronological order, the pattern became obvious, like a tide's outline pressed into sand. Each generation closer. Elena drove to Calhoun County in September 2021. The forest that had replaced the plantation felt quiet in a way that didn't resemble emptiness, it felt attentive. The air held that metallic scent locals still called sea rust. She searched for the foundation stones. They were buried under roots. Yet when she dug, brackish water welled up between her fingers as if the ground had kept a secret reservoir just beneath its skin. That night she stayed at the only motel for miles. At midnight, the power flickered. When she looked out the window, she saw movement among pine trees, faint lights gliding between trunks. 3. Always in a triangle. At 2:17 a.m., Elena began hearing a humming from somewhere beyond the forest. Not thunder. Not wind. Not machinery. It was a tone so low it felt like pressure rather than sound. When morning came, Elena found herself at the county museum. The curator, an old man named Calder, showed her the black carving recovered after the hurricane. He said quietly, "It's heavier than it looks. Some nights it hums." When Elena pressed her palm against the glass, the humming stopped. The air shifted, as if the room had drawn breath and held it. She left the museum shaken but compelled. On her drive back, she passed the wall site where the stones had once scattered. There was nothing left but scattered rocks and wild grass. Yet when she slowed the car, she saw the ground was darker in one section. Wet even though the day was dry. A single pool of brackish water sat there like a dropped eye. Within it was a small pale handprint. Weeks later, a fisherman near Cello Island found a woman's car abandoned by the shore. Her phone and recorder remained inside. The last file timestamped 11:58 p.m. A partial transcript circulated among archivists. I can hear them. They're close now. The water, it's moving even though the tide is out. There are lights under it. Shapes. I think they know I'm here. I think they always knew. I can see eyes. Oh God, they're not. The tape ended with a sound like waves crashing, though the sea was calm that night. By 2022, genetic testing companies noticed an unusual increase in sequencing errors among users along the southern coast. A leaked memo mentioned non-human code patterns contaminating coastal samples. The data was suppressed quickly. Still, a private researcher released a map, later removed. It showed clusters of people across 3 states with a shared genetic marker. The pattern traced an ancient shape, a crescent bending inward, like a wave turning on itself. Calhoun County lay at its center. Locals insisted the forest had begun to change since 2019. Small pools appeared after rainfall and did not dry. Trees leaned east, roots reaching toward the direction of the old wall. At night, they said, there were low rhythmic sounds, wet and slow, like sea breathing beneath soil. Hunters found scales embedded in pine bark, pale, half the size of a man's hand. Other people whispered about pale figures glinting between trees, moving like swimmers. When the full moon rises in September, locals said, the insects stop singing. Silence became absolute. Then the humming began again beyond the tree line, 3 notes rising and falling like a heartbeat. Those who heard it said it felt less like a sound and more like a memory returning. The tide didn't come quickly. It didn't crash. It rose with patient certainty around those who listened. Not in a flood of fear. In a return. By autumn 2024, coastal towns evacuated. Salt water climbed highways. Marshland drowned. Forests that had never known tides became wet and brackish in hours. Authorities blamed rising groundwater due to tectonic shifts. Locals said otherwise. In Calhoun County, at the exact site where the Bogard Wall once stood, water finally broke the surface. It bubbled up through soil in a slow, steady rhythm, 3 pulses at a time. Then, under the full moon, the earth opened. Witnesses said the light beneath the ground looked like the sea itself, luminous, not fiery, not electrical. Some claimed they saw figures within the shimmer. Others said they heard voices calling names. In the morning, the forest was gone and the land had sunk by 6 feet. The state called it a geological collapse. Those near the edge said it smelled of salt. If you listen closely, you could hear the sound again. The breathing. The waiting. The land became unstable for miles. Roots rotted as if undermined by something alive. The pine forest stood half drowned in brackish water. Lights flickered beneath the surface, moving like lanterns drifting in a submerged city. Old families left without waiting for government instructions. They packed and fled, certain that staying was not bravery but delay. A few remained. Among them was an old caretaker named Reed, who had once worked on the property before the hurricane. He told anyone who would listen that the sea was reclaiming its bloodline. He said Eleanor's choice wasn't madness. It was prophecy. She opened the way, Reed said. She never died. She just went home. No one believed him. Not until Reed disappeared one evening. His house sat empty afterward. The sheriff found only wet footprints leading out the back door, barefoot human-sized steps moving toward the water's edge. The prints didn't come back. Weeks passed. Strange phenomena spread. Wells turned saline overnight. Birds refused to cross patches of air. Insects vanished. More children were born with eyes that shimmered gold. Midwives marked births quietly, recording them under false names and writing prayers they didn't understand. Scholars examining old maps noticed something that didn't fit any geology. The waterways of Calhoun County seemed to have shifted over decades into a vast spiral. Traced from above, the pattern widened outward with its center exactly where Willow Creek had stood. Inside the spiral, compasses failed. Electronic devices drained quickly. Air held a faint tang of salt even on windless days. Locals called it the Deep Eye. Some said it wasn't a place but a presence turning slowly beneath the land. Others said it was Eleanor herself, watching through water, waiting for descendants to return. A small research team ventured into the area to collect soil samples. Their names were never published. Only their field notes survived, later found in a repository under restricted access. The last entry read: "The ground is breathing, not metaphorically. It's expanding and contracting as though the water below is alive. The vibrations match recorded frequencies. 22 Hz repeating in triplets. The sound, it's not coming from below, it's coming through." Their camp was found flattened the next morning. Equipment scattered. Every trace of human presence washed clean as if rain had occurred. But there had been no rain. Only a spiral drawn into mud with a single finger. A month later, fishermen off the coast reported columns of light rising from the ocean floor, silent, pale, impossibly straight. The Coast Guard dismissed it as atmospheric refraction. Satellite images captured the shape anyway, movement beneath water, 3 points forming a triangle. The same formation described in notes from 1853. And so the story continued. Not as a single tragedy but as an ongoing adaptation. Because once the wall fell, boundaries became suggestions. Some nights, when the moon is full, the waters along the Georgia shore became glass smooth. If you stood perfectly still at the edge, you could hear a woman singing, not in words, but in a tenderness that sounded like the beginning of a memory. She sang about the trapped, about those who remembered her blood. Some claimed that if you answered even in a whisper, the tide rose higher around your feet than the rest of the shore. It didn't take you with struggle or pain. It took you gently. By degrees. By inevitability. Fear, in the end, belonged only to those who had not yet seen what had already arrived. In the archives of the Atlanta Historical Institute, a faded page, believed to be written in Eleanor's hand, survived. No one could confirm its origin, but the words remained legible enough to make any reader feel watched. The sea does not take what it loves. It remembers. When the remembering is complete, it comes to gather its children. Even now they say, when the full moon bleeds silver over drowned fields, the water glows softly. You'll see her, standing waist deep in the tide, cradling a child whose eyes burn gold in the dark, watching and waiting until the water rises again. And if you listen long enough, you begin to realize the most unsettling truth. The tide didn't stop. It only learned to arrive in ways no one can measure with ordinary clocks. It learned to come as a vibration in bones. As salt on the tongue. As a song you recognize without remembering where you heard it first.